Our next speaker today, Carl Rosen, is a professor in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the U, where he served as department chair for several years, from 2011 until just last year. Carl's research and extension programs include identifying needs and establishing priorities in areas of plant nutrition and improving fertilizer use efficiency for crop production across the state. Primary emphasis is on irrigated crops as well as fruit and vegetable crops commercially grown in Minnesota. Carl?
Thanks, Tom. And it's good to be here on the extension circuit again. As Tom said, I was department head for many years, so good to be back. So I'm going to talk about chloride in agriculture, and I have it here as the forgotten plant nutrient. As you know, there's 17 essential plant nutrients required by plants. Chloride or chlorine is one of those, but we often don't think about it too much. But there's some reasons why we perhaps should be looking at it a little more closely. So some of the topics I'm going to cover is the chlorine or chloride cycling in agriculture. We'll look at some of the pools, transformations, inputs, and losses. We'll look at it as a plant nutrient. You definitely can have some beneficial responses to chlorine or chloride, but also there can be some negative responses as well, and we'll get into that. And then more recently, there are environmental impacts due to chloride, as it is very leachable. And then we'll get into some research, perhaps some research gaps that we can think of. So a lot of what I'm talking about is a study that's supported by AFRAC, and the kind of the motivation or the reason for this has to do with that there is more scrutiny of chloride-based fertilizers due to the potential for leaching and runoff. For example, 006, a very common fertilizer for potassium, as you all know, is 47% chloride. And so we are putting it on. We often don't think about it, though. It's an understudied nutrient. We've done lots of potassium studies, but in most cases, the chloride comes along for the ride, but we don't really think about whether there's any effect of that chloride. So if you look at other states, there have been positive responses depending on the crop. But at the same time, there can also be some detrimental effects because at high levels, chloride can be detrimental due to the salt content, particularly the salt-sensitive crops like soybeans, for example. But what we're finding out about chloride, we think of chloride as just being there. It's kind of like just an anion that's present. But there are a lot of organic chlorine compounds that are contained in plants. There's about 100 different organic compounds that have been identified, but it's unclear what role they play in plant nutrition. Chloride has been linked to lower disease incidence, and it's not. I mean, most of it is in the inorganic form, but how much is in the organic form is largely unknown at this point. So a little bit about terminology. Chloride is the inorganic monovalent anion. It's the inorganic form. It exists as a very soluble anion, Cl-. Elemental chlorine on Earth's temperature, it basically exists as a gas. It's manufactured. We don't worry about elemental chlorine that much, except if you're going to be using it, disinfectants and things like that. We look at chlorine in agriculture, though. It includes both the inorganic chloride, that anion, and also the organic chlorine compounds. So it's kind of analogous to nitrogen. You have nitrogen organic compounds that can be mineralized into either the ammonium and then eventually nitrate form. Chlorine can be incorporated in organic compounds and then can also be mineralized by microbes to the chloride form. Chlorine is about the 21st most abundant element on Earth, so there's a fair amount of it in the environment. Large deposits are in minerals. It's also, as you know, a very strong component of ocean water, 20 parts per million in ocean water. And let's see, so in terms of agriculture, though, most of that chloride exists as the very soluble chloride form, but organic chlorine may be more important than previously thought. So here's the cycle. It's a little simpler than a lot of other nutrient cycles, but basically you have the different inputs, so mineral fertilizers, plant residues, atmospheric deposition, and different compost, biosolids, all of those are inputs. There's different pools in the soil. You have organic matter as a pool. A lot of it's just in the solution, and there is some pool of minerals that may occur. In terms of losses, you have a lot of loss primarily due to leaching, which is one of the environmental concerns. Crops can take up some chlorine or chloride, and there is actually some gaseous forms of chlorine that exist as well. We'll get all into this in just a little bit. Okay, so let's look at chloride in plants. It's taken up, as I mentioned, as the monovalent anion chloride. It is a micronutrient, but interestingly, it's taken up in macronutrient quantities. So you think of a micronutrient in terms of parts per million, you're looking at percent. Even if it's not taken up in very high amounts, it's still in a percent basis in many plant tissues. The amount that's taken up is actually higher than the actual requirement of the plant. We know in terms of functionality of what chlorine does, or chloride, it's essential for photosynthesis. And because it is an anion that's basically soluble, it is involved with osmotic regulation and charge balance within the plant. So if you have a lot of potassium there, a lot of times that potassium is going to be balanced by chloride, because you can't have only positive charges. All these positive charges have to be balanced with negative charges. And then, as I mentioned, there are organic chlorine compounds. There's over 100 of them that have been determined or measured, but the function of these organic compounds is largely unknown. Okay, so there are beneficial effects, and some of the beneficial effects have been related to disease suppression. Some of the crops that have been documented where this disease suppression occurs are in wheat, barley, corn, rice, potato, sugar beets. There is some of that going on. But then at the same time, there are some of these harmful effects. Toxicity of chloride is actually probably more common than deficiency in many areas of the U.S. The chloride contributes to excessive soluble salts. It makes it more difficult for plants to take up water. And some crops are more susceptible or more sensitive to high amounts of chloride. And these include fruit trees, soybeans, edible beans, cotton to some extent, and tobacco. So if we look at some of the pools of chlorine in the soil, it's relatively low in most soils, about 0.02 to 0.05%. But it depends on where you are in the U.S. In the Midwest, we're kind of landlocked. A lot of if you go to the coasts, there's higher concentrations just due to the fact that you have a lot more deposition of chloride from the seawater. Some of the sources of chlorine from rocks include igneous and metamorphic rocks. There's a lot of evaporites. depending on how that soil was formed, things like apatite, hornblende, biotite, and then halite, which is basically sodium chloride, old seed deposits. Those can also provide chlorine and chloride. So solution, chlorine, chloride, the monovalent anion is the most common form. Exchangeable chloride is very minor. As you know, our clays are negatively charged, and so that would be repelling chloride anions, similar to nitrate. So for that reason, it is very, very mobile. There is an organic pool of chlorine. It may be more important than previously thought, and it is an active area of research, particularly in more natural areas. It's becoming a very major research emphasis. So in terms of the organic chloride or chlorine, the organic matter contains about 0.01 to 0.5%. So you can't ignore it. It has to be considered as part of the geochemical cycle. And there are microbial transformations that occur, but we don't really know exactly which microorganisms are involved and how much is actually in that organic form. But you do get mineralization where you get release of chloride, and you do get immobilization where it can be tied up in organic compounds. But the significance at this point in agriculture is not very clear. And for the most part, we just concentrate on the chloride form of chlorine in agriculture. So if you take a look at soil test levels of chloride in agricultural soils, there was a test, this is a courtesy of AgVice Labs, who publishes their results, and that you can see as you go to the west, where you have higher amounts of natural or native potassium, you tend to have lower amounts of chloride in the top 2 feet. So what this shows in 2020, the amount of chloride in the top 2 feet, and the greener the area, the higher percentage of soils with less than 40 pounds, which is kind of that cutoff of where you might expect to see a response. And interestingly, in 2020, there was quite a few soils in this area that had low amounts of chloride in the top 2 feet. Unfortunately, in 2023, they have to have 100 samples to report the results. So there's no results in 2023, but I found it interesting to see out in this area that there are some soils that are low in chloride in the top 2 feet. And you can see the kind of the guideline for what is considered low. Anything less than 30 is considered low, and so forth. So in terms of inputs of chloride, most of it is from atmospheric, some of it is from atmospheric deposition. It depends on where you are. If you're on the coast, you're going to see a lot more deposition through the atmosphere. You can see these red areas on the coast. In the Midwest, you can see we're relatively low. We've done a number of analyses of rainfall over the years, and you can see it's mostly less than 1 part per million at any one time. And if you look at an average amount of rainfall that occurs in Minnesota, it would be only about 2 to 5 pounds of chloride coming from atmospheric deposition. We've done a lot of work in the irrigated areas, and surprisingly, there's quite a bit of chloride in some of our aquifers. And you can see up to 40 parts per million in some of them. And that can add a lot of chloride in just through the irrigation water itself. So that's kind of interesting in an area that needs to be perhaps looked at a little bit more. Other inputs of chloride are manure and other organic sources. some of the measurements that we've done recently, dairy manure, liquid dairy manure had about 10 pounds of chloride per 1,000 gallons, and swine manure over double that. So there's quite a bit of chloride that can be added just with manure. But by far the largest input is inorganic fertilizer, potassium chloride. As I mentioned, it's 40%, 47% chloride. So large amounts of chloride are added with potassium fertilizers. There are other chloride sources that can be used, calcium chloride, but they're not used in very large amounts. So in terms of an inventory of where chloride comes in Minnesota, there's over 200,000 tons of chloride applied to Minnesota croplands each year. And most of that's in the form of 0060, potassium chloride. You can see that that makes up a little less than a quarter of all the chloride that's in the state or that's being accounted for down here. Because we're in a cold state with freezing roads, a lot of the chloride is actually coming in as sodium chloride as for de-icing salts. So almost half is coming in there. So a lot of the chloride issues, at least environmentally, are due to the road salt. But there is some issue with chloride with potassium sources as well. So it will be a source of chloride that can enter into the ecosystem. So when you think about chloride, you almost have to think about potassium at the same time. So in eastern and southern Minnesota, potassium chloride is often used to meet the potassium needs. Natively, these soils tend to be lower in potassium, particularly because of our parent material. As you go west, you have higher amounts of native potassium and therefore less application of potassium fertilizers. So normally we don't think about chloride because we're applying, particularly in this area, we'd be applying potassium as 0060. So it just comes in, we don't have to think about it. But when you get further west, potassium is not often applied because it's natively high. And so you might be using potassium chloride to supply chloride needs as opposed to the potassium. And you see much lower amounts of chloride in soils as you move west because there's less potassium chloride being used and there's not much deposition. So chloride can be low in those areas. And that previous map kind of matches up well with some of the soil test levels. You can see as you get into areas in the eastern part, there's higher amounts of soils that are below that 150 parts per million. As you go west, there's less. So chloride, as you move west, may be more important. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the responses that may occur due to chloride. So this is work, there's been a lot of work in South Dakota. This is on wheat, and this is the yield difference. So if you apply chloride versus no chloride, how many bushels increase might you get? And so you can see that when you're in this very low soil test chloride area, you're going to get more of an increase when chloride's applied as opposed to when you have higher levels of chloride in the top 2 feet. So across this 5-year study, there is an average grain yield of about 2.5 bushels with an average net return of $3. And this is a study that was published not too long ago in 2017. So what about corn? This is a study that was done in Kansas. It was a 2-year study. And what they showed was, here's the control. They often, when you're when you're doing a chloride study and you're using potassium chloride, you need to be able to separate out what's due to potassium and what might be due to chlorine. So a lot of times we'll put in a calcium chloride control in there. And you can see this particular study, it looks like they were also getting perhaps a slight potassium response, but relative to the control, you're still getting something with calcium chloride. And so there did seem to be a significant chloride response. So they concluded that if chloride soil tests are low, less than 20 to 25 pounds per acre in the top 2 feet, that corn is likely to respond economically to chloride fertilization. And they concluded that an application of about 20 pounds of chloride was sufficient. So because of this scrutiny on chloride and also because of potential responses, we wanted to do a study in Rosemount and on corn. And this is a rain-fed area. The soil test was at 95 parts per million potassium and the chloride was 45. So it's a little bit higher. So we probably wouldn't be getting a response here, but we'll show some of the results in a little bit. We looked at 11 treatments to try to sort this out. And one of it was not just to see if we were getting responses, but we wanted to see how chloride was cycling. And we'll get into some of that in just a little bit. So we looked at grain yield, stover biomass, and chloride in the grain and stover. So I'll get into some of these in just a little bit. So there are lots of treatments. We looked at the potassium chloride source. We compared it with potassium sulfate, chloride, potassium chloride at 50 pounds, 100 pounds, 150 pounds. We also had a manure-based application based on nitrogen, supplying us 68 pounds of chloride. We had our calcium chloride control, and we also have, because of soybeans, and I'll talk about that just a little bit, we want to see what's going on with soybeans in 2024. So that's what we're looking in 2024, but 2023 is what I'll be showing some of these results on. So we did not see it because the chloride was 45 pounds per acre in the top 2 feet. We didn't see any statistical differences, but I think we can clearly say that we weren't getting any negative responses to 150 pounds of potassium chloride. This one right here is 150. The dark green is the potassium sulfate. Here's the control, the blue, and then these other sources, manure and calcium chloride. So if anything, we got a little non-significant bump with potassium chloride at 150 pounds of potash of K2O per acre. These up here show the amounts of chloride that were added with these different amendments. So no statistical response, but probably maybe a little bump just due to the potassium itself. I'll get into the uptake in just a little bit. I want to say a few comments on soybean responses to chloride. And of the major crops grown in Minnesota, soybeans probably the most chloride sensitive. Dan has done a lot of work on looking at chloride in soybean. What he's found, obviously very high rates of chloride will induce a yield reduction, 2 to 15 bushels. But even at more modest rates, this is over 5 years, he's shown that maybe about a 1 to 2 bushel per acre reduction due to chloride fertilizers that are being used. So if potassium is needed for soybean, if it's very low, so modest rates can be used, perhaps apply it during the corn year, or use a sulfate source if potassium is needed, although the cost there tends to increase, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. So losses of chloride. Chloride is like nitrate, it's very mobile. It's repelled by clay particles. It's going to move through the soil, so there's a high potential for leaching, particularly in sandy and tile drained soils. In terms of what goes in out of tile drains, there's not a lot of research. There's some research, but an Illinois study showed about 20 to 24 parts per million in the tile drain, and annual fluxes can be about 50 to 60 pounds of chloride per acre losses in tile drain. Losses on sandy soils are not well studied, but we do know with increasing amounts of chloride in groundwater, it is leaching, and that's an area that we'll probably be looking at in the future. So why is chloride a problem? High levels are harmful to animals in freshwater aquatic life. So some of the amounts that are provided based on Minnesota Department of Health and MPCA, acute levels are 860 parts per million and chronic 230. And if you look at the monitoring of wells in Minnesota, there are about 16 of the monitoring wells are above that 230. So it is increasing. I think a lot of it has to do with the road salt that we're using, but there could be some contributions from agriculture as well. Okay, so other losses of chloride. So there is volatilization. It does go off as a gas. Fungi in particular are capable of forming volatile compounds. Chloromethane or methyl chloride is the dominant form that's volatile. And however, if you look at the amounts that are actually being released, they're relatively small compared to the amount of fertilizer or road salt that's being used in the environment. In terms of removal, that's another loss. It's going to vary with crop species, the variety, and the amount of potassium chloride fertilizer that's used. So this, as I mentioned, this is that Rosemont study again, where we took a look at how much is in the grain and in the stover. These stacked graphs, anything with S, that's the stover. You can see most of the chloride remains in the stover part of the plant. And the grain will take up maybe about 4 to 5 pounds. And it didn't really seem to matter too much on how much chloride was supplied for the grain. The stover, on the other hand, does increase with increasing a chloride rate up to a point. It did seem to level off once you hit 100 pounds of potash or 78 pounds of chloride applied with that potash. But as you increase the chloride, it was taken up, but largely it's in the stover. So for 100 pound per acre potash rate, you're applying 78 pounds of chloride. About 33 pounds were taken up by the plant. But there was only about 4 to 5 pounds that were removed because most of it remained in the stover, and then that's going back into the soil again. So you have about 73 pounds that remains in the field from that potash application. The fate then is that some of it could be leached, some of it might be immobilized, which is something that we need to look at, and then some could be volatilized. So that's kind of the fate of what that chloride is when it's applied. So we also looked at some of the residual chloride in the top 2 feet. And you can see again, as you increase the chloride potash rate, you're increasing the amount of chloride in there. I would have expected more with this higher rate. It seemed to kind of level off. But you can see that you are getting some increases in chloride in there as residual as you use that potassium chloride fertilizer. So background levels of chloride, this has not received chloride in many years. You can see that even without any application, there's still about 47 pounds, 45, 47 pounds that are in that top 2 feet. And the potassium sulfate treatments were similar to the check treatments. So it's only when you started adding it, either with manure or potassium fertilizer, that potash 0060, that you started seeing that increase. So let's see. I already went through this slide. I don't know why I have it again. Anyway, this is the uptake. We already went through that. You're going to have about 73 pounds related remaining in the field. So strategies to minimize chloride losses. Again, you can try to follow the 4R approach, follow the fertilizer guide. Don't over apply potassium fertilizer, potash 0060. Perhaps look at some band placements, reduced rate. So anytime you're applying less, there's going to be less chloride there. Time the application close to the period of uptake, although it may prevent leaching early on, but if it's just taken up into the stover parts, it is going back into the soil again. And then the other option is to use non-chloride sources of potassium fertilizer, but the cost there can be a main issue. I mean, it's almost 2.5 times for a given amount of potassium for potash sulfate of potash compared to muriate. You're going to look at quite an increase in cost. So that may not be a feasible way of doing it unless you have very high value crops. So, yep, so I'm just about done. The research gap, better understanding of chloride fate following different management practices. The role of chloride, organic chloride, as I've been mentioning, is a little unclear. How much do you need in the residue? How much remains in the residue? How much mineralizes? And I think we need to kind of take a look at what's going on with the irrigation water on corn and soybean yields. That could be an issue down the line. We've already done some work on potatoes, and we've seen some issues going on with that. So overall key summaries and points. Chloride is an essential plant nutrient for all plants, although we don't often think about it because we apply it with potassium chloride fertilizer. It is a micronutrient, but taken up in larger amounts. Chloride needs are often met when potassium fertilizer is used. If the soil potassium is natively high, that's where you may see a response to chloride, and responses are possible when that chloride is less than 40 pounds per acre in the top 2 feet. So use low amounts of 0060 for soybeans, only if potassium is needed. Maybe apply it during the corn year. Relatively small amounts are removed in the grain, so a lot of it gets cycled back into the soil, and that residual chloride is subject to leaching and is becoming more of an environmental concern. So more research, as I've been mentioning, is needed to look at the whole biogeochemical cycle and minimize those losses. So that's it. That's my last slide. Is there time for questions? There are questions. Are there any visual signs of chloride toxicity in soybeans or edible beans? So if you get high enough, you will see scorching of the leaves. In most cases, we don't see that. If you're only looking at a bushel or two decrease, it's just more affecting the yield, and you won't see any visual signs of that. Is that true, Dan? I'm pretty sure. I haven't seen, yeah. 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 Right. Is there an interaction between chloride and pH? I don't think there is. I mean, it's a fairly stable anion. The only effect of pH would be if it's too acid, I mean, it's going to be affecting root growth, so it's going to affect, just uptake of nutrients in general. But I don't see any, it's not like phosphorus. It's where you see a very strong response of, the type of, the form of phosphorus. Chloride's not going to change at all. So do alternate potash sources such as Aspire contain the same amount of chloride as regular MOP? Yeah, it would be very similar, about 47%. Let's see, would you expect chloride deficiency if corn stalks are baled and removed from the field? So testing is poor. Yeah, so that's a good point. If you're removing the stover, the corn stalks, you are removing chloride with it. And so, yeah, that chloride in the top 2 feet will be decreasing then if you're removing that. Do I have time for more or one more? Is it necessarily a bad thing to lose chloride in a 2-crop system when it's so toxic to soybeans? If you're growing soybeans, probably it's not that bad. Yeah, I mean, you really, anytime you're losing it to the environment, there's always going to be these trade-offs. But in terms of growing a soybean crop, it's not that bad. But environmentally, maybe. So thanks.